Each would be cited, and each would be traced in terms which would expose it as a root cause. And of course, none of this was offered. So if this person thinks that this is a serious response, obviously they do not engage with other people who ever respond to anything in any serious way. In other words, on one day we can pretend to be standing on one side of the line of principle, and on another day we can be on the other side, and we can help these people as if it's helping all of the public, when in fact it's only persisting in the crime. And all this is accountable somehow, when in fact it's not accountable for anything at all.
What would you have expected? What were you looking for that you didn't see?
He was the senior advocate for prohibiting the regulation of credit default swaps and also lifting the leverage limits on the investment banks.
So not only can we detect directly from this that Hank Paulson hasn't identified any root faults, much less resolve them. We can deduce directly from this that on the contrary, he's giving free rein to the criminals to perpetrate, to live out the crime to its fullest possible extents by removing any restrictions on them whatsoever. And so the question is, why would he do that if he weren't a criminal?
So again,
he mentioned those things? I never heard him mention those things.
Could we turn this off for a second?
When AIG was bailed out, the owners of its credit default swaps, the most prominent of which was Goldman Sachs, were paid $61 billion the next day. Paulson, Bernanke, and Tim Geithner forced AIG to pay 100 cents on the dollar, rather than negotiate lower prices. Eventually, the AIG bailout cost taxpayers over $150 billion.
$160 billion went through AIG, $14 billion went to Goldman Sachs.
At the same time, Paulson and Geithner forced AIG to surrender its right to sue Goldman and the other banks for fraud.
Isn't there a problem when the person in charge of dealing with this crisis is the former CEO of Goldman Sachs, someone who had a major role in causing it?
Well, I think it's fair to say that the financial markets today are incredibly complicated.
Of course, likewise, none of this ostensible complication is necessary. On the contrary, all of it exists as part of the necessary deception, which seem to make our needs to trade with each other free of impediment, exploitation, and so forth, impossible to achieve without complication. None of us understand why these complications necessarily exist, nor do they offer any argument, not even the most convincing hint. So this is just thrown back at us knowingly by a fellow criminal, because what's really going on here is needless complication. All these new schemes that they come up with to defraud the people and to steal from them further aren't necessary complications. And if this man had identified any root cause whatsoever, of course, all of this would have been eradicated. On the contrary, he did the opposite.
Supply urgently needed money.
On October 4th, 2008, President Bush signs a $700 billion bailout bill. But world stock markets continue to fall amid fears that a global recession is now underway.
We don't merely have fears that a global recession is underway, nor is it merely a recession. In fact, this whole idea of business cycles is preposterous because, first of all of these artificial difficulties are imposed by others upon us who are acting criminally against our common objects. Now, from the very first day of the lifespan of this obfuscation of the currency, you have a perpetual escalation of falsified indebtedness to mere publishers of the evidence of our promissory obligations to each other. In the end of the lifespan, the rate of escalation is incredibly escalated because the increase, periodic increase in the sum of debt is so much as the periodic interest on an ever greater and the inevitably terminal sum of debt. So in the end, being as the sum of debt is greater than it is at any prior time, you have far greater escalation of the failure in the end. So this isn't a matter of cycles where we purportedly, recover. In fact, at sometimes only we may make better headway against this escalation of artificial indebtedness than at others. But there's no cycle of recovery and recession. Instead, on the contrary, we have a single cycle of ever escalated artificial indebtedness, which impedes our prosperity and obstructs us from prosperity to an ever greater and eventually terminal extent.
The bailout legislation does nothing to stem the tide of layoffs and foreclosures.
Indeed, then, and as I have so long said, the reason that it can do nothing to stem the tide of foreclosures is because of this precipitous escalation of artificial indebtedness, which has already destroyed our creditworthiness to borrow further. And so this obfuscation of the currency explains all these further ramifications, and it is the real meat, the real thing that we should be focusing on in order to understand the significance of these outer events, which are the focus instead of this documentary.
Unemployment in the United States and Europe quickly rises to 10%. The recession accelerates and spreads globally.
I began to get really scared because I hadn't foreseen the whole world going down at the same rate at the same time.
By December of 2008, General Motors and Chrysler are facing bankruptcy. And as U.S. consumers cut back on spending, Chinese manufacturers see sales plummet. Over 10 million migrant workers in China lose their jobs.
At the end of the day, the poorest, as always, pay the most.
Here you can earn a lot of money, like 70, 80 US dollar per month. As a farmer in the countryside, you cannot earn so much money. The workers, they just wire the salary to the hometown to give them family. The crisis started in America. We all know it will be coming to China. Some factories try to cut off some workers. And some people get poor because they lose the job. The lives get harder.
We were growing at about 20%. It was a super year. And then we suddenly went to -9 this quarter. Exports collapsed, and we're talking like 30%. So we just took a hit, fell off a cliff, boom.
Even as the crisis unfolded, we didn't know how wide it was going to spread or how severe it was going to be. And we were still hoping that there would be some way for us to have a shelter and be less battered by the storm. But it's not possible. It's a very globalized world. economies are all linked together.
Thus, as I have so long explained, for over 40 years, the nature of the inevitable failure is global, particularly when most of the systems are not independent at all, begin at practically the same time, are subject to little difference in real growth, are subject to little difference in deployed interest rates, and when the collapse of one sector inherently precipitates in the collapse of adjacent sectors who, by the obfuscation of the currency, are jeopardized likewise. So indeed, this failure is global because the obfuscation of the currency is global, because central banking systems have been imposed upon the world not because they serve us, but because those who have advocated them have sought to impose a system of what is no more than terminal exploitation upon us. Thus, as we have well enough demonstrated, indeed, unless we, the people, rectify the improprieties of the present obfuscation of our promissory obligations to each other, in fact, we can succeed in nothing meaningful but ensuring our inevitable dispossession and failure. There is no such thing as banking regulation which can save us from the inevitable consequences of banking itself. As we have so long said then, we have one problem and one solution: mathematically perfected economy and absolute consensual representation. Thanks again for listening. It's an honor to be taken seriously regarding the most vital matter of our time.
Long